Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Ideas Mean Business webinar. I'm Siobhan Smith, Lead for Diversity and Inclusion at KTN, and it's my honour to introduce our host for today's webinar, Abigail Heard. Abby is part of the manufacturing team within KTN, helping manufacturers to innovate and innovators to manufacture. Abby makes targeted links to the right knowledge, partners, facilities, and funding with a view to driving productivity and economic growth. Abby leads on helping innovators to manufacture, supporting companies with hardware prototype scaling up manufacturing. This often involves asking challenging questions early on to maximise the likelihood of commercialisation success. Understanding the market designed for manufacture, supporting manufacturing supply chain development, finding manufacturing partners, manufacturing strategy, and preparation for funding or investment is all part of what Abby does. So today we're delighted to welcome Abby to share her knowledge of manufacturing with us all. So over to you, Abby.
Thanks, Siobhan. I'll just figure out how to share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see that okay? I'll just put the chat up as well. So if you've got any comments or whatever, if stuff's not clear, you can stick it in the chat and I'll be able to keep an eye on what's going on there as well. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you for coming today. I'm really encouraged by the fact that you're all here. This session is on navigating the design to manufacture journey. And as such, it'll be most relevant to businesses that are developing physical products, so tangible artifacts, things that require manufacturing. Much of the thinking will be relevant to other types of businesses, but physical products are going to be our main focus. So I don't know if you've noticed or given it much thought at all, but developing physical products is particularly hard. In fact, it's significantly harder than developing apps, data, or service products. And we can see this when we start to look at the survival rates of startup firms. So often when I present this statistic, people are a bit shocked. 97% of physical products startups fail to scale. So companies with physical products that require manufacturing fail to scale, compared with 70% of tech startups. So only 3% of companies developing physical products will make it to scaled up manufacturing. So why is this? Why is this such a problem? Well, there's three broad reasons for this. Firstly, the diversity of skills and experience that's required to bring a product to market. Secondly, there's an increased dependency when you're making a physical product on third-party relationships, so relationships with manufacturers, with designers, with people supplying parts, components, materials, that sort of thing. Relationships are so important here. And thirdly, significant investment is needed upfront. So what I would say is, although it's hard, although only 3% of companies operating in this space will be successful, it's not impossible. So it gives me hope, the fact that you're all engaged and proactively looking to connect with support. And what I'm looking to do today is to give you a quick overview, so just a wee taster of what the journey looks like. So I use the analogy of a journey. For me, that works well. So what I see myself as doing is providing a map. So the idea is that it shows you what's required for the journey ahead, but it's not like Google Maps. There's no clear path. The journey's tough and it's new terrain, and this map isn't going to do the work for you. It won't even make the plan for you, but hopefully it will stop you getting completely lost or setting off unprepared. So one of the most difficult things I deal with in my day-to-day job is when innovators' expectations are mismatched with the reality of the situation. So perhaps from a selfish point of view, but also genuinely because I think it's what's needed most, I feel the most helpful thing I can give you today is a map, so a way to think about the overall journey. So people tend to think that a good idea is enough, and unfortunately, that just isn't the case. So I really believe that a mediocre idea that's executed well has more chance of success than an excellent idea that's poorly executed. So There's three main aims for today, three things that I would like to cover. Firstly, I'd like to talk a little bit about the mindset required, how you approach this whole journey from design to manufacture, like the map, basically. And I'll run through various considerations, so things that are important to think about on the journey. And then finally, just really briefly, I'll mention some of the skills that I think is worth being really intentional about developing if you're developing a physical product. So at each stage, I'm going to pause and just check the Q&A box and have a wee look at the chat and make sure that I've not lost any of you, see if we've got any questions. Any questions that we don't touch on as we go through, we can try and get to them at the end. But if your question's not answered at all, then I'll do my best to follow up with you afterwards, like through email. So firstly, we're going to look at the mindset required. So 9 times out of 10, or more than 9 times out of 10, what I find is that innovators come looking for a manufacturer or a route to market once they feel their design is done. So they're like, Abby, I've got this design, help me find a manufacturer. So usually, yeah, they move from design, they kind of feel like they're done, look for manufacturing, and then they come to this realization that actually they need some investment. And heartbreakingly, because they've not thought about manufacturing early enough, things start to fall apart a little bit. So people tend to spend a long time developing their idea, sometimes in isolation, sometimes without feedback, without talking to anyone. There can be a bit of a tendency towards being protective of what you've got, understandably. And the manufacturing and commercial aspects and the building relationships around that stuff can be a bit of an afterthought. But when third-party relationships, securing investment, and diversity of skills are so critical, especially for developing physical products, things that require manufacturing, this overemphasis on design and being really protective can be a counterproductive strategy. The most successful companies I find are the ones that manage to think about all three aspects at the same time, who simultaneously consider the design, the manufacturing, and the commercial aspects. So actually, this isn't a problem that's unique to startups. So the approach I'm going to share with you, what I'm going to talk about, is something that I've learned and developed and applied through research work, which has been sponsored by really large product development firms, so like global medical device producers, big defence companies, commercial aerospace, automotive companies. They all have the same sort of problem. So I've spent the majority of my career trying to understand how big firms can improve the efficiency and effectiveness of moving from design to manufacture. But I think the same things, the same thinking can be applied to startup firms as well. And I think taking this approach is key if you want to maximise success. I think failure to take this approach is part of why there's such a high dropout rate for people developing physical products. So my background is in systems engineering. That's where lots of these ideas come from. So I'm not going to go into lots of detail about systems engineering or systems thinking today, but if you're interested, or just so you know, what I'm encouraging you to do really is systems thinking. So you can go and look up more about that if it's of interest to you, systems thinking. So if we break down those three aspects, what actually needs to be considered, based on my experience, I'd say that there really are 7 aspects that we need to think about when navigating this design to manufacture journey. So these things are the market needs, market size, design, the production volume, the manufacturing or production methods or processes, design for manufacture, and the cost to produce. It's not just that we need to consider these 7 things. What's important is the way that we consider them. So we're going to cover the details of each of these things in a moment, but for now, I want to think about the big picture. They've given you the map a bit. So I'll zoom through what I mean by it all quite quickly. And it might be stuff that's really obvious to you, or it might be a little bit confusing. But I think in life, we're often taught to break down problems into like isolated components, think about things in isolation. And I'm going to ask you to unlearn that. So unlearning's hard. I'm going to ask you just to go with it a little bit, and then we'll dig into the details a bit more in the next section. So I'm asking you to trust me that the more you think about this, the more you apply it, the clearer it will become. So what we don't want to do is to exhaustively try to understand each one of these considerations before moving on to the next one. So we don't want to try and get 100% understanding of market needs before we think about market size, and so on and so on. So try not to think about these things sequentially: market need, market size, design. Think about them in an order that makes sense. Think about the connections and the interdependencies between these different considerations, and start to fill in the details as you go. So it's not a linear process. So you're not thinking about one thing at a time. So what should we be doing? So ideally, what you'd ideally look to do is start to gradually build up a picture of all the considerations. So we need to think about the impact of each consideration on the others. For example, when you're thinking about market needs, it'll provide some requirements for the design, and then we'll be able to start to test those requirements against the market needs. When we start to think about the market size, we might start to think about production volumes, which means we'll have to think about the production processes, and perhaps move on to a little bit of design for manufacture. And all the while, we'll still be learning more about market needs and refining our decision making as we go. For example, we might have several design concepts that are all based on slightly different markets, each with a different target cost, different production volumes, and different manufacturing processes. And we might wait to select that concept, finalise our design to manufacture, until we've understood which market has most pull. So we might be playing with several different scenarios at once. And rather than deciding on, we've completely understood the market needs, we're going to move on to design, we're playing with different options and building up a big picture by considering all these different aspects at once. Or we might be in the same situation where we've got several design concepts, each with a slightly different manufacturing process. And we might be having conversations with different manufacturers. And then we can select our concept, our design, based on the one that's going to be the easiest to produce, where we can get commitment from a manufacturer. So rather than thinking about decisions in a really linear way, building up a picture of all the considerations. So do think about the interdependencies between the different connections, and think about the impact of each aspect on other considerations. Be conscious about maturing information across all these considerations simultaneously. Build up a picture of the overall landscape and think about the missing bits of the puzzle. So yeah, somebody's asked the question in the chat, how to make a market research business plan based on a product that doesn't exist, considering there's no way to know how much it'll cost to mass produce. So I guess you're not looking to concretely answer any one of these questions, any one of these aspects. So you start to look at options for a business plan based on options for a product, and then you work out what the different options are for production, for cost to produce, and you kind of converge on a decision. So rather than thinking about the market need, the market size, the design sequentially, you kind of look at all the different considerations and converge on something that's going to work. I don't know if that makes any sense. I'll pick up Q&A in a wee moment if that's all right. So yeah, overall, this approach means that you'll have less rework, so you'll have to unpick less decisions, and you'll be able to manage your risks better. So you're less likely to end up with a design that's not manufacturable or is unwanted or unaffordable. So ultimately what you need to focus on is creating a plan for building a product that can be produced at a cost that's affordable and provides a return on investment. So this part, the cost to producing something that you know people will be able to afford, is going to give you a return on your investment, is kind of where all these other considerations need to converge, the point that you want to get to. So key takeaways for this part are: think about manufacturing and how you're going to fund the process of scaling up. So don't just think about creating your design, think about how you're going to get it manufactured, how you're going to get it to market. Think about the connections between your decisions and the impact of your decisions, and think about the long-term goal of getting your product manufactured. So I'm not sure where that's going to land for you guys. I don't know if it's really obvious or if it's slightly confusing. I know for me that this way of thinking isn't binary. It's not like you fully understand it or you don't understand it at all. For me, it's a bit of an approach or a mindset that matures over time. So after working in this area for 15 years, I'm still learning and seeing subtleties in it all. And it's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy process. So my plan here is to pause and check if you've got any questions. And if you're interested in this approach, you're thinking about the mindset a little bit more, there is a blog on the KTN website, which I can just post in the chat window. I'm not sure if I can see Q&A without stopping screen sharing. I can. Okay, so we've not got any questions. I think rather than pausing and waiting for questions, I'll probably just move on. And if you've got questions, so yeah, somebody's asked where to look for a manufacturer. I'll cover that in a little second. It's one of the points I pick up later on. Yeah, so we'll cover Q&A at the end or towards the end. If people have got questions, if they type them in the chat, then I'll see them coming up and I'll try and address them as we go through. Okay, so my plan for this next section is to go through all these considerations, so the 7 considerations that we've got here, and give you a bit of a heads up about the things you might want to think about. So the first part was maybe a little bit philosophical. This part should be more practical. So we've got limited time, and realistically, with the diversity of products that you guys are going to look at, there's no way to be really comprehensive. You could spend years looking at how to do this really well. I'm just going to give you like an indication of what you might need to be thinking at each stage, and hopefully that's helpful. So the first one, market needs. Market needs. So it seems like common sense, but actually understanding what's needed by the market is really key. And I know how easy it is to be so sure that we've got the right idea when actually others have got a completely different perspective. So before we invest effort and time and money, it's worth checking that we're really understanding what the issue is. And often just asking isn't enough. So sometimes people can't articulate what they want. It isn't unusual for a customer or an end user or another stakeholder to think they want something when actually what they need is something completely different. So for example, they might think they need a full new system when actually all they need is a little widget to fix a flaw in their current system. So the more we can do to find out what people need and check that we've understood correctly, the better. And not only does this avoid making mistakes, but it adds value, it adds insight into the situation. It can help you develop something, come up with a product that's really desirable. So in terms of understanding the market, it can be really helpful to think beyond just your end user. So yeah, thinking about other stakeholders, other people that are going to come into contact with your product that are part of that process of getting it out to market. So perhaps you can design something that already exists as a solution, something that's already on the market, but you can design it in a way that's easier to manufacture. If you can make something easy to manufacture, you might be able to make it cheaper or integrate it with other products, and that might be enough for you to win significant market share. Equally, like thinking about that, the opposite way around, you could design something, so something like a bike component, say, that the end user, cyclists, absolutely love and they want to buy, but the product never gets off the ground because it doesn't fit with standard bike manufacturing and distribution processes. So although the end user might like it, people that manufacture bike components might not be up for taking on your products because they'd have to invest in a whole new production line. So thinking about what the manufacturer needs as well as what the end user needs can be really helpful in terms of making sure you've got a product that can actually be manufactured and get to market. So you might be limiting yourself to aftermarket sales. You might be making manufacturing really expensive and difficult for yourself. So you might be limiting yourself to cyclists retrofitting your idea to bikes, when actually, if you thought about what the manufacturer needs, you could have a huge and potentially really easy to service market through bike manufacturers. So that's just a very niche specific example, but it's just one example of think about other users, other people that come into contact with your product. And think about the broader opportunities that comes with that as well. So yeah, these can be challenges, but they can also be opportunities to give you competitive advantage. So yeah, it makes sense to understand all these other stakeholders. So does your product fit on pallets or into containers, for example? Does it need to go in a square box to fit on a shelf in a shop? Does it need to be stackable, lightweight, flat pack, reuse, modular, easy to service, easy to take apart? Think about what these needs are of all the people that come into contact with your product. So your market need has a really natural relationship with thinking about design. So rather than thinking about your market needs and then moving on to design, the two things should really go hand in hand. In many ways, your design should kind of fall out of a really thorough understanding of what's needed in the market. So top tips for considering market needs: look to understand, build relationships, speak to people. And I think, importantly, I'm not going to say too much on this, but learn to talk about your product without disclosing specifics. So yeah, just throwing it in there. I'm not going to go into loads of detail. I can pick it up afterwards in Q&A, but don't let NDAs and patents stop you from developing relationships around your ideas. I think when it comes to IP, there's lots of reasons and strategies that you might want to employ. You can protect your brand and your concept without getting a patent. And if you want to know a bit more about that, we've got an IP webinar just for people developing physical products, for people developing products that are getting manufactured, that can be really helpful. But don't let IP stop you talking about your ideas. Just be careful about not disclosing specific aspects of them. So yeah, there's a little link. I can drop it in the chat just now, and that link will take you to a series of webinars, one of which is on one of which is on IP. Yeah, another question about manufacturers. We'll come to that in a moment. So yeah, the next consideration is market size. So usually when thinking about market size, people consider like the total market available and then take sometimes what's quite an arbitrary percentage of how many people they think might buy their product. And perhaps when we're talking about a digital service or app, that might be a sensible approach. It might make sense. But when we're talking about manufactured product, things become a little bit more complex. So you've got to think about, like, will you have the capacity to cater for the full market for everybody that might want to buy your product? So at the outset, will you be able to do that? Will you ever be able to do that? what's going to limit your ability to scale? Are you restricted by the materials available, by how many sales you can make? You know, distribution channels for physical products are different from downloading an app online. They're more complicated. There can be capacity issues. Usually, in terms of manufacturing, one of the hardest things to do is how to grow from zero to a couple of hundred. Getting your first set of customers can be really difficult. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So it might make sense to jump to thousands of units straight away in terms of like cost per unit or efficiencies, economies of scale. And it might be easier to engage with a manufacturer. So manufacturers are often really not interested in small orders, and it can be difficult to establish relationships with manufacturers when you're talking about small volumes. But if you're jumping to thousands of units straight away, you might have other issues like distribution, or how do you deal with customer service when you've sent out thousands of products at once, or at a really practical level, if you want to be able to service a large market quickly, manage the risk of that, and the investment to set up production to do that can be really difficult. So yeah, as you start to think about the market size, you're going to have to think about production volumes and the economies of scale or the cost to produce around that. And all these things in turn will impact your design decisions. So designing for a small market might look quite different to your design if you were going for a large mass market. So yeah, all these decisions are interlinked, and that's kind of what I want to encourage you to think about. So top tips for thinking about market size is think about your ability to service that market, as well as the potential total market size. So think about demand and your potential to fulfill it. And consider different strategies. So what would your design, what would your cost model look like if you only had a few customers versus if you had hundreds of customers or thousands of customers? How would your cost model vary, and how would that impact your design? So the next consideration is design. And I guess it's maybe all starting to sound quite complex. It's quite a lot to think about. And design is a skill. It's something that's often undervalued or trivialized. So if you can afford to, then it can be good to get help of a professional or spend some time developing some of these skills yourself. So for the purposes of navigating the design to manufacture journey, I define design as the process of reducing the risk of further investment. So it's the process and knowledge captured that establishes the basis of the product or system. So it's like the plan, basically. Design is the process of planning. So whether you want to do the design work yourself or enlist the support of a professional, these are the sort of skills that I would recommend that you develop. You may need like engineering analysis skills too, but the ones listed here are generic and will help you navigate the overall process. Firstly, the first skill I think is really useful to have is to be able to think from other points of view. So learning to see things from different perspectives. Secondly, being able to critique your own ideas. So think about why your ideas might not work. Not to be negative, but to improve the robustness of what you're doing. So yeah, think about if somebody was going to be really critical and try and tear your idea to bits, how would you defend it? And what do you need to do to be able to address these challenges? The third one is think about or learn tried and tested design principles and methods. So little tricks, sort of techniques that can help you move through design, help understand your customers, help you generate concepts, help you critique your ideas better. So as well as technical methods like say CAD or engineering force analysis, there's techniques for design and understanding that can be really useful and not so technically demanding, but can help you really develop your idea. The fourth one would be to prototype and test your ideas. So I'm really enthusiastic about the idea of building models and putting them out there for people to break and prod and get mucky and tear to bits. Like, encourage people to play with your ideas, to play with your designs, figure out what works and what needs refinement. And I'd say the cheaper the prototype, the better. So prototypes don't have to be sophisticated and fancy. They can be a verbal description. So describing your design or idea verbally is a valid sort of prototype, a sketch, a CAD model, a cardboard cutout. You could get something 3D printed if you wanted to be slightly fancier, or you could have both all in and have a full working version of the prototype. But think about why you're prototyping, what you want to use your prototype for, what part of your idea you're looking to test or improve or develop. Yeah, go for the cheapest option. Do what's going to get you most information for least effort and least cost. And the more you can test your ideas, the more robust they'll become. So I definitely encourage you to do that and develop prototyping skills, develop model building skills, or develop your ability to talk about your idea. So yeah, the other one is use design standards where applicable. So have a look at the British Standards website. It's good practice to understand the requirements for the specific area you're working in. So whether that's consumer electronics, medical devices, children's toys, etc., make sure you're designing to the standards, because these are going to be what's used to test your idea before it gets to market. If it's what manufacturers are going to be interested in, it's what investors are going to be interested in, you need to show that you've designed to standards that might be relevant, and those will be very specific to the area that you're developing your hardware product in. So in terms of resources for design processes and principles, I find these ones quite helpful. So I love these two little books. So you can get larger versions, but these are little mini pocket book versions, and they just give you insight into how designers' minds work. They provide a good first step for beginners. And I think even for more experienced people, they've got nice prompts in them. There's IDEO method cards. So IDEO are a design consultancy. They've developed these method cards, which are maybe slightly old-fashioned now. They can be a little bit pricey to buy online, but you can Google similar methods. So if you're looking for a design method, go ahead and Google methods to understand my customer better, methods to critique my design, methods to generate new concepts, etc. But IDEO method cards are a collection of different methods to help you improve design. At KTN, we've developed a set of cards called 30 Ideas for Circular Economy, which can help you think about responsible and sustainable design practice. So both in terms of your physical product, but also your wider business model. So that can stimulate some thinking and is also a really good design resource. So bear in mind that design adds significant value. So about 70 to 80% of the cost of your product is committed at the design stage. So the decisions you make in design have huge bearing on what your product's going to cost overall. So you can do things like make the manufacturing processes slightly more efficient, get cheaper materials or whatever, but actually you're committing to those costs at the design stage. But there's also the value that good design can add, the ability to delight your customer, to develop a clever product, to make it as easy as possible to manufacture. So the value that can be added through design shouldn't be underestimated. So top tips for design. So whether you're working with a designer or on your own, I'd say don't be too focused on a specific outcome. So I'd say invest your time, your design time and resource in making better decisions. So by that I kind of mean, I've seen people get grants to be able, so money from government, for example, to work with a designer to help them progress their product. And rather than using that money to make better decisions or to really employ the designer's skill and knowledge about product development, people employ the design agency and insist that they develop a prototype or fancy renders, fancy product drawings, when actually the designer's time could be better spent on really developing the thinking behind the product. So if you're using experts, I'd say give them a bit of freedom to work out the best way to progress your product. And I'd also add, even if you're doing the design work yourself, don't become obsessed with developing a fancy prototype or shiny drawing or a slick CAD model before it's absolutely essential. Make sure you've tested and developed using low-cost methods to build your confidence before you go all in with something that's really shiny and expensive. Tell stories, talk to people, sketch, make cardboard models. These things will tell you a lot really quickly, whereas a shiny prototype, a big sophisticated model, might not tell you that much. People might be really impressed, but it might not tell you that much that's going to be useful for product development. Yeah, I'm just noticing questions and comments coming in. I'll come back to them in a second. Sorry. So yeah, the skill of a designer is knowing how to explore this landscape that's inherently uncertain. So if you're doing design, you're doing something new. If you're developing a product, you're doing something that is uncertain, it's unexplored. So be prepared to find answers you didn't expect. If you know the outcome at the start, then what you're doing isn't innovation, it's not design. Be open to being wrong, be open to learning, and you'll get most out of doing design. So the next consideration is production volume. So these are closely related to market size. They're tightly coupled with the manufacturing method and the cost to produce and the market needs. There's loads to consider here, and it's a variable that's really tightly coupled with the other factors, the other 6 considerations. So I wouldn't rush to get to a right answer here, but I'd recommend that you're aware of the implications of a range of different production volumes on the production method, the design, and the product cost. So for such a critical decision, I'm so blown away by how often people who think they've finished their design and they're ready to start manufacturing haven't even considered how many they might need to produce. So you need to be thinking about this early on. It needs to be central in your decision making. So here are some broad brush rules for thinking about production volumes. So with higher volumes, there will probably be a lower cost per unit. So tooling's expensive and you need to divide that cost over all the units you'll make. So high volumes generally means cheaper cost because you've got more units to divide it over. So because our orders are larger, with larger volumes, you'll have more weight with manufacturers. They'll be more interested in working with you and more likely to value your business. It's probably worth noting here that it's actually really difficult for manufacturers and designers to work with small companies. So working with small companies, or small orders, working with small orders tends to lead to a loss, while working with established customers who tend to have larger orders generates a profit for these businesses. So contract manufacturers have to pay the bills. They've got people they employ and they need to be careful about who they work with. So don't be angry about it. Don't be frustrated. Just take account of this as you go through the process. So if you're asking for small production volumes, it might be more difficult to engage with manufacturers. That is unfortunately just how it's going to be. So be prepared for that as you go through. Don't become frustrated and angry as you come to the end. Plan for it in advance. And yeah, as you go through design, as you start to make these decisions, be conscious of that. And yeah, don't be surprised when it comes to it. For larger volumes, you need a larger upfront investment, which means there's more risk. So your design work needs to be really tight. You need to really have confidence that you know the market well, that you're doing the right thing if you want to convince people to invest in it. Smaller initial runs might mitigate some of the risk, which is why people tend to start with low volumes. but this presents lots of issues of its own. So although lower risk, the low volumes can make it really difficult to engage with manufacturers, and there can be a higher unit cost. So I'd say build relationships early. Think about who might be able to manufacture your product. Find out what their terms of engagement are, what sort of companies they're looking to work with, what volumes would they consider feasible, and try to incorporate this as one of a number of scenarios in your planning and design work. So if you're looking for a local manufacturer, like somebody that's UK based, and there's a good website, I actually meant to post the link, but I've not sorted that out. If Kevin, if you're online, do you think you could post the reshoring UK link in the chat, please? If not, I'll do it at the end. But yeah, so yeah, reshoring UK can help you find a UK-based manufacturer. But if you're looking for a local manufacturer, this list isn't exhaustive, but it offers a decent starting point. Or yeah, get in touch with KTN manufacturing team. We can help you find local manufacturers, or we can connect you to people that can help you find international manufacturers, so manufacturers in China or Asia or yeah, Eastern Europe. We can help make those connections. But yeah, if you're looking for those connections to be made, you need to be at a point where you're actually ready to meet manufacturers, where you're ready to have that conversation. But yeah, having informal conversations is something that I'd encourage, or getting to know at least what yeah, terms of engagement are, what sort of volumes would people consider feasible. Something else that's worth considering early on is licensing or partnership arrangements, either with a contract manufacturer or someone who's already making a similar product or catering to a similar market. So if you can piggyback onto someone else's sales, manufacturing and distribution network, it can mean that you can scale your product really quickly. And although you might get a smaller proportion revenue of each sale, you're likely to get a lot more sales and at a lot less risk to you. So yeah, not having to worry about things like distribution and customer service can be massive. So yeah, finally, consider the investment required and the cash flow for different requirements, for different production volumes. So think about how much money you're going to have to raise for tooling, for example, at different volumes. So yeah, next consideration is the production processes. Depending on what you're making, the form it takes and the properties you need it to have, different manufacturing methods will be more or less suited. So that makes them really obvious. Each manufacturing process has its limits in terms of the type of material, volume of production, and the different geometries, the different forms it can cope with. So it's worth being aware of which processes might be suitable for your product, and then finding out a bit more about how they work and the advantages and what their advantages and limitations are. And this will help inform your production volume decisions and your design decisions. So from quite early on, you should be able to establish broadly what type of methods might be most appropriate for what you're doing. So whether it's like injection molding, whether it's going to have to be made with additive manufacturing, whether like traditional machining is going to be most appropriate. You should know broadly what sort of processes you're looking at. And so sometimes it's not that intuitive. Sometimes it requires a little bit of thought. So yeah, for example, you might imagine that it's cheaper to make your product from pulped paper than plastic, but actually when you cost the tooling for moulding the paper against the cost of 3D printing, you might find that for the low volumes that you happen to be interested in, plastic's cheaper. So plastic, strangely, counterintuitively, maybe might actually have better outcomes from a sustainability or functionality or finish point of view. So yeah, plastic can be sustainable. Sometimes things are not as they seem. So these sort of considerations are worth exploring. Does it really need to be made of metal or plastic? Think about alternative materials and advise on keeping things as simple as possible. Try not to over-engineer your product. So if you're interested in making a manufactured product or product development or manufacturing generally, I'd recommend this book. It is a really good book. It's a reference book that details a wide range of manufacturing processes. That sounds like it's going to be something that's incredibly dull, but actually the way this book is presented is really easy to engage with, easy to read. And what you might find is that rather than just learning about the manufacturing process that you want to make your product, it can actually, understanding the manufacturing processes can really inspire design. So you can realize, oh, now I understand that manufacturing process a little bit better, I could design my product like this. So it can actually inspire the way you think about design and help you develop better products that way. So second to last consideration, we're getting there, is design for manufacture. This is such a huge topic and so specific to the product you're making. There's no way I'm going to cover everything here. So I'm just giving you like tiny little flavour of some of the things that you might want to kind of think about. The decisions that you need to make will be really unique to your product. So this, for example, understand the processes and materials that kind of link to the last point, like, but in more detail. So understanding things like injection molding, thinking about what your product's going to have to look like in those specific instances. For example, with injection molding, you need to be able to remove the part from the mold. So if there's angles, that's going to be really difficult. The easier it is to get the component out the mold, the quicker the manufacturing processes are going to be, the less complicated they're going to be, the more efficient it's going to be to produce them, the less quality issues there'll be. So yeah, that's one example of like how you would want to design for injection molding, but there's a whole other set of considerations specific to injection molding, and then similarly a whole separate set of considerations for other manufacturing processes too. So depending on how the tooling's configured or like wall thicknesses, you might have to think about different draft angles. There's a whole set of rules for different manufacturing processes that are worth thinking about. Check design standards. So design standards can give you really clear instructions about how to design for manufacture, how to specify components for manufacture. I guess specific to electronics really, and if you're working in electronics or designing circuit boards, then there are standards that provide really clear rules that can be helpful. Another principle is to minimize the number of parts. The more parts, the more complex, the more expensive, the more likely to break, more likely to have defects and quality issues. So there is skill in all this stuff. I'm saying it like it's easy. I mean, it takes skilled design to get to this point, but yeah, general principle, minimize the number of parts. Standardize parts, so try and use the same type and size of fittings throughout your product, even if it means slightly over-engineering in some instances. It's much easier to make, it's easier to maintain if all the screw sizes are the same, for example. And if you're working across a family of products, you might want to consider keeping this consistent. Or if you're looking to integrate with a larger system, so say you're designing bike parts and you want it to go onto a bike, then think about the other like Allen keys or whatever, Allen bolts on the bike, and try and keep that consistent across your range. Think about the products you're integrating with too. Minimize the steps for assembly. So think about putting things together along the same axis, designing them so they don't have to be rotated to fit together, so everything lands in one direction. If your process is going to be automated, that's really, really critical. If it's going to be anything mass produced, it's important that you think about that. And this example also shows how you can reduce the number of parts as well. So as well as design for manufacture, you can design for X. So that X can be filled in with pretty much anything. But one thing to think about might be design for logistics or retail. So for example, how are you going to package your products so they're easy to ship around? Do you want them to stack together? Do you want them to fit in boxes, on pallets and containers? How's your product going to sit on a shelf? Is it going to be in a box or just stand on its own? How are they going to look on a shelf? Are they going to be on hooks? Are they going to sit on their own? And then thinking about the types of shops that you want to sell in and how they might display their products. There can be quite a lot to think about, but design for X or design for logistics or retail, or you could design for sustainability, for example. So if sustainability is a key part of your ethos or important to your market, is something you really might want to think about. Design for inclusivity. So if you want to maximise your market or make sure your groups, marginalised groups, are able to use your products, then sometimes you need to design around these really specific areas. And then finally, the cost to produce. So this is the final thing, the final consideration, and it's really the crux of all the other aspects. So if you can't square this circle, if you can't make it for prices people are willing to pay and get a return on your investment, then it's all in vain, or you're going to struggle to get investment to move to manufacturing. So this needs to be kind of like the consideration at the forefront of your mind, the one you're looking to gain clarity on at each step of the way. So this is the decision to which all other decisions lead. Unless you've got really deep pockets and you can just continuously throw money at an idea, then that's kind of what it's all going to boil down to. So I'm not going to go into lots of detail about cost modelling, but you need to be cognizant of developing a cost model to work out what the cost is per unit, the investment you require, and really keep that in mind. Does this tie in with what people are expecting to pay as you go through? Okay, so that's 7 considerations covered. And I've also covered the mindsets that was required to address them. So I was going to stop for questions, but I'm aware that time is ticking on. So I'm just going to rattle through the last wee bit and hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. So yeah, so the last thing I was going to cover was mentioning some of the skills that you might need to sit alongside all this. So it's not an exhaustive list, it's just 3 things that spring to mind that I think are important. So the first one is managing cash flow. Be aware that this is what could very well sink your business. So as you go through, if you can't get somebody to invest in your production or get somebody to license your product, there's going to come a point where you're going to run out of cash. So with most tech, you're in tech development, product development, you're in negative cash flow until you launch. But with physical products, you need more investment. Sorry about the squiggly line here, but that dip, the investment you need is going to send you into even more negative cash flow, and then coming up the other end, because you're going to have a distribution network, it's going to take longer to recoup your investment. So you really need to be planning for this investment in manufacturing from the very beginning. Be thinking about the long game from the beginning and planning your cash flow around that, because it's what the chances are it's what's going to take you out of the game. The other tool that's really essential is networking. So learning from other people and getting people on board to help you along the way. So with whether it's investment, whether it's feedback, manufacturing or design support, signposting to funding, hints or tips, routes to market, stockists, etc. You can't do this alone. You need a diverse range of skills and experience, and being well connected really helps. The final thing is communicating. So you need to be good at communicating your ideas, and that's a 2-way thing. So that's communicating as in listening, so understanding what people need to know and what motivates them, And secondly, being concise and clear and explaining what it is that you're doing. So I say, really don't be lazy when explaining what you do. Put in effort to being as clear as possible. Make it easy for people to help you. If you're sloppy in explaining your ideas, people are going to be less inclined to want to invest in helping you. So understand that people are busy. Don't be angry if you don't get a response straight away. Generally, people do want to help. By being good at communicating your ideas, you can help develop your ideas as well. So you can think about what's missing from your story. So one of the things you can do is look at this Stronger Stories website. It talks about telling a story around your idea. So if you feel like bits of your story are missing, it can help actually develop your idea as well as being a tool for communicating and getting investment or support. And there's also a blog I wrote on the KTN website about communicating as well. So I'll post that wee link in a second. So that's really all I wanted to say. I hope you've found it helpful. I'm just going to zoom through your questions in a wee second, but we're actually in the process of publishing some of the material that's been shared today in a guidebook. So watch out for that. And this is the first time I've ran a session on on this material. So feedback would be appreciated. We'll use it to refine the content of the guidebook. It'd be especially useful to understand, if anything, what you found helpful, what was less useful. Is there big gaps in information? Please feel free to get in touch if you've got comments and questions that we don't get to today. Or if stuff pops up in the future that's not on your mind today, yeah, get in touch in the future and we'll do our best to get back to you. So I think we've got a little bit of time for some questions.
Yep. So Abby, I'll just pop in here and ask the questions so you can just focus on answering them. So we've got one that asks, can a physical product startup get seed funding considering all the data unavailable at earlier stage?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. Like, there's not any reason why not. It's about managing the risk and being able to convince investors that you are you're worth the risk. There's always going to be a risk with investment, but just showing that what you've got is credible and that you've thought about these 7 considerations. So if you go with a design and you've not thought about manufacturing at all, so even early on you need to be thinking about these other aspects. There's accelerator programs that focus specifically on hardware companies. So we have one of the sessions that sits alongside the webinar, and the link I posted earlier is with Hacks. So Hacks are an accelerator program that runs specifically for hardware startups, so physical product startups. If you watch that webinar, there's lots of insight into like how to get investment in sort of hardware startups. Worth watching.
Brilliant, thanks Abby. And then we've got another one which says, can you give advice on how to protect your product when you are looking at manufacturers? Because you have to share your product designs and specs to what could potentially be a stranger. So how can you make sure that you are still protecting your design and your product?
So yeah, I guess the first thing would be I wouldn't share them randomly. I wouldn't share them in every conversation. So before you get to the stage of even thinking about sharing them, I'd be making sure that you're in the right ballpark in terms of the volumes you're looking for, that you're happy in principle with the broad cost. And then you'd be thinking about a non-disclosure agreement, but I wouldn't go to all the hassle of getting them to sign a non-disclosure agreement until you at least knew that they had capacity or that they were interested in the production volumes that you were talking about. So I'd check out some basic stuff and then non-disclosure agreements. But it is difficult as a small business to protect your idea. It is difficult, so there's got to be a degree of trust there.
And then last question, can you charge customers money when you've made the first few tens or hundreds of units when some standards have not been passed, such as CE marks or Bluetooth standards?
I'm not sure about that. I guess you need to have some sort of insurance for yourself as a business, and yeah, I guess, yeah, I'm not sure. I need to know about the specifics of your product, Julie, I think, but feel free to send me an email or yeah, get in touch.
Okay, so that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much, Abby. That's been really, really helpful. So I want to, obviously thank Abby for hosting today's session. And I know it's helped me understand the manufacturing journey a little bit more. I hope that it's helped you and some of the steps that you need to take to be successful. I'd also like to thank everybody that joined us online today. Our next Ideas Mean Business webinar is taking place on the 27th of October, where Izzy Obeng from Foundervine will be explaining how to build a sales strategy. So we hope you can join us for that. If you'd like to keep up to date with all the Young Innovators news and events, please do sign up to our newsletter, follow us on Instagram, or visit our program page. And you can now join our new LinkedIn group as well. So once again, I'd like to express a massive thank you to Abby here for hosting a wonderful session today, and to you all for joining us. We hope to see you again next time. Goodbye, everyone.